The small-town diner buzzed with Sunday lunch chatter, oblivious to my world collapsing. Brenda Jenkins, my fiancée, slid a crumpled napkin across the sticky tabletop, revealing a cheap motel key. "Gary and I are sharing this," she whispered, her eyes bright. "You can still pay for the Florida trip." The highway lines blurred beneath my tires, a dull white-knuckle grip keeping my old truck pointed east. Brenda Jenkins' words echoed in the cab, vibrating against my skull, clear as a bell. "Gary and I, honeymoon, while you pay the bills." It wasn't a question. It was a statement, delivered with the certainty of a woman who had never been told no. My jaw ached from clenching it so tight. The late afternoon sun dipped low over the cornfields, painting the horizon in bruised purples and oranges, a fitting color for the anger simmering in my gut. I turned the truck into Brenda's driveway, gravel crunching under the worn tires. She stepped out of the passenger side before I could even cut the engine, her movements fluid and unconcerned. "Get out," I heard myself say, the words thick and guttural, barely my own. It wasn't a request, it was the sound of a line drawn in the dirt, a chasm opening up between us that neither of us could cross. I knew it then. This was the end, the final, bitter end. Years dissolved into bitter ashes. I thought back to Friday night lights. Me, the star quarterback. Her, the town beauty queen, cheering from the stands. We were supposed to be forever, carved into the history of Miller's Ridge. Two halves of the same shining coin. That promise now felt like a bad joke, a naive dream from a different lifetime. The air in the truck was heavy, stifling. Brenda leaned against the passenger door, her arms crossed, a defiance set to her mouth. She always got her way. "Mr. Schmidt already arranged it," she said, her voice even, calm. "He has an apartment ready for us. You just need to put down the deposit and first month's rent. It's $1,800. Us, her and Gary Peterson." My stomach twisted tighter. $1,800. That was nearly every dime I had saved from 2 seasons of landscaping and weekend shifts at the hardware store. 1,800 gone in a flash, I thought, the calculation searing itself into my brain. "I can't afford this, Brenda. We're done." The words felt heavy on my tongue, but they were true. She just blinked, a slow, deliberate movement, as if I hadn't spoken, as if my protest was merely a minor inconvenience. "Gary and I are going to Des, Florida for our honeymoon," she said, a small, distant smile touching her lips. "You'll love seeing me happy." The sheer audacity of it, the absolute void of empathy, left me breathless. It was a fantasy she had cooked up, oblivious to the ruins around her. I pulled the small velvet box from my glove compartment, the engagement ring still inside, and slid it onto the dashboard. My fingers felt numb as I twisted the simple gold band from her left hand, placing it carefully beside the box. "We're done," I repeated, my voice flat, empty of emotion. "Just leave." Her eyes narrowed, the smile vanishing. "You'll regret this," she yelled, her voice raw, as she stumbled backward, her knee catching on the doorframe. She rubbed it, a sudden flash of pain crossing her face before she turned and limped toward the front door of her building. Gary Peterson appeared from the hallway, stepping out onto the porch. He was taller than me, built solid. Brenda went straight into his arms, burying her face in his chest, her sobs echoing faintly across the quiet evening. He held her tight, his gaze meeting mine across the twilight yard, a look of calm triumph in his eyes as my old Ford pulled away, leaving them framed in the yellow glow of the porch light. Hours later, the moon was high, casting long shadows across our yard. I'd been asleep for maybe an hour, the weight of the day pressing me down, when I heard the creak of the front door downstairs. Then footsteps on the main stairs. My parents. I figured it was just them coming up to bed. But the footsteps kept coming, heavy and deliberate, past the second-floor landing and up the narrow steps to my apartment over the garage. The door, which I kept unlocked out of habit, pushed open with a low groan. Gary Peterson stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the dim light from the hall. "What are you doing here?" I demanded, pushing myself up onto my elbows, annoyance warring with a dawning sense of dread. He didn't answer, just stepped inside, his chest heaving. "You ruined everything," he spat, his voice low but sharp. "Our plans. My plans. You couldn't just cooperate, could you? You had to make a scene. He blamed me for not going along with his elaborate scheme, for not funding his new life with my fiancée. His sense of entitlement was sickening. Something in me snapped. The anger, held so tight all day, broke free. I launched myself off the bed, a blur of motion. My fist connected with the side of his jaw. A dull thud. He staggered backward, surprised, then fell, hitting the floor with a grunt. I was on him in an instant, pushing him down, my knee driving into his chest. Another hit, a dull thud against his side. The air left his lungs in a wheeze. Then from far off, a siren. Faint at first, then growing louder, cutting through the quiet Midwestern night. It pulled me back, a cold splash of reality. I looked at Gary, still on the floor, breathing hard. The siren swelled, closer now, then closer still, turning onto our street. I descended the stairs, each step heavy. At the bottom in the hallway, my mother stood, shoulders shaking, her face buried in my father's chest. He held her, his gaze meeting mine, tired and resigned. The wail of the siren stopped abruptly outside. Then came the knock, loud and insistent, on the front door. Deputy Olson arrived with another patrolman, their boots tracking muddy prints across my parents' clean linoleum. He was a familiar face, a man I'd seen at countless high school football games, but his gaze was different now, hard and official. He questioned me first, sitting at the kitchen table while my parents hovered, pale and quiet, by the doorway. I gave him the facts, calm and steady. Gary came into my home, uninvited. He started yelling. I pushed him. I told him Gary had been taunting me, blaming me. I left out the part about the engagement, about Brenda, about the Florida trip. That felt too personal, too humiliating for official record. Deputy Olson wrote it all down, his pen scratching against the paper, his expression unreadable. While I recounted my story, Gary Peterson was at the town clinic, a single street light casting a weak glow onto its brick facade. He sat hunched on the exam table, the attending nurse, Mrs. Davidson, observing him with a professional, almost skeptical eye as he described his injuries. A throbbing jaw, a pain in his side, a feeling of general malaise. He made sure to mention every bump and ache, every possible consequence of my fists, transforming a scuffle into a brutal assault. Brenda, meanwhile, moved with swift purpose. By midday, her version of events had already spread like wildfire through the small town. She painted me as a violent, unstable ex-fiancé, a jealous man incapable of handling rejection. The story traveled from the diner, to the feed store, to the church bake sale, each retelling adding a layer of dramatic detail. Small towns were like that, a tight-knit web where gossip was currency, and I was suddenly the subject of every whispered conversation. The town of Miller's Ridge, once my home, became a landscape of averted gazes. Some of the older folks, who had known my family for generations, offered looks of quiet pity, their eyes holding a distant sadness. But most, the younger crowd, those who knew Brenda and Gary, saw me as the aggressor. The community was divided and the scale tipped heavily against me. The assault charges were official. My parents, practical people who had worked hard their whole lives, immediately began to scramble. My father made calls, his voice low and strained. My mother watched the checkbook, her brow furrowed. They would tap into their limited savings, money put aside for a new roof or my sister's college fund, to find me a lawyer. The weight of their sacrifice settled on my shoulders, heavy and cold. We met Mr. Henderson in his office above the bank. He was a man with thinning hair and a no-nonsense demeanor. He listened, his gaze fixed on me, occasionally interjecting with a sharp question. "Assault and battery," he stated, leaning back in his worn leather chair. "With Gary's alleged injuries, it's serious, Dale, especially given the circumstances." He didn't offer comfort, only facts. He warned me that Gary's embellishments, coupled with Brenda's narrative, would be hard to counter. I learned later that Brenda and Gary met with the prosecutor several times. They solidified their story, polishing it until it shone with a false gleam of victimhood. They spoke of my alleged threats, my sudden, unprovoked attack, painting me as a monster, an uncontrolled force that had to be contained. They built a case, brick by brick, against me. Back at the factory, the hum of machinery was a constant drone, but the silence from my coworkers was louder. Whispers followed me down the assembly line eyes tracking my movements. The weight of it all pressed down, a quiet despair that settled deep in my bones. I worked my shifts, moving through the motions, feeling like a ghost in my own life, isolated and alone. The preliminary hearing was set for a Tuesday. When I walked into the small-town courtroom, the hard wooden benches were packed. The entire town seemed to have turned out, filling every seat, their faces a sea of judgment and morbid curiosity. The air was thick with expectation, the smell of old wood and hushed anticipation. Gary was called to the stand. He wore a neat shirt, his face still showing a faint bruise on his jaw. He gave a tearful, embellished account of the attack. He spoke of fear, of being woken by a raging man, of my unprovoked violence. He wiped his eyes, his voice cracking, making me look like a dangerous, unhinged monster. He was a good performer. Brenda sat in the front row dressed in a somber navy dress. She nodded sympathetically as Gary spoke, her hand pressed against her chest, a silent testament to her shared suffering. Her quiet gestures lent Gary's performance an air of authenticity, a supporting role perfectly executed. Mr. Henderson, my lawyer, stood to cross-examine Gary. He tried to paint Brenda and Gary's scheme as provocation, highlighting the unusual nature of their request for me to fund their apartment. He asked pointed questions about their prior arrangement, their expectations, but the judge, a stout woman named Judge Evans, seemed unconvinced, her expression stern and unyielding. The charges would stand. I was released on bail, but with strict no-contact orders regarding Brenda and Gary Peterson. I couldn't go within 50 feet of either of them, couldn't call, couldn't send messages. It was a formal acknowledgement of the chasm that now separated us. As I walked out of the courthouse, the crowd parting around me, Gary Peterson caught my eye. He stood by the old oak tree, Brenda at his side. He gave a small, smug smile, then mouthed, "This ain't over, Dale." The words were silent, but I felt them as clearly as if he'd shouted them. Later that week, my parents signed papers at the bank. They had mortgaged a small part of their farm property to cover the escalating legal fees. The strain was evident on their faces, lines etched deeper around their eyes. It wasn't just my fight anymore. It was theirs too. The new apartment above the old hardware store on Elm Street felt promising at first. Brenda and Gary moved in, boxes stacked high, a new beginning laid out before them. The initial excitement, however, was a thin veneer. It chipped away with each passing day, revealing the rough wood underneath. The dreams of Des, Florida, of a fresh start, began to feel distant, unreachable. Gary's true colors didn't take long to show. He spent his days on the worn couch, remote control in hand, while Brenda navigated the small kitchen. He expected meals to appear, clothes to be washed, the apartment to maintain itself. The concept of shared chores, or shared expenses for that matter, seemed foreign to him. His lazy streak was not an occasional indulgence. It was a permanent fixture of his character. The Florida honeymoon, once so vivid in Brenda's mind, a shimmering escape from Miller's Ridge, was indefinitely postponed. "Just waiting for the right time, honey," Gary would say, waving his hand dismissively when Brenda brought it up, his eyes still glued to the television. The right time never came. The money for even a modest trip wasn't there, and Gary made no move to find it. Brenda had always been used to a certain level of comfort, a quiet stability that came from my unwitting support. Now the stack of bills on the kitchen counter grew taller with each week. Rent, electricity, water, groceries, each one a stark reminder of a financial reality she hadn't anticipated. Gary offered little help, his contributions meager and sporadic, always with a story about a big score just around the corner. She picked up extra shifts at the diner, her feet aching by the end of the day, the smell of grease clinging to her clothes. She watched Gary sleep late, watched him waste time, and a quiet resentment began to simmer beneath the surface. Her diminished lifestyle, the constant worry over money, grated on her. This wasn't the life she had imagined. One evening, after another long shift, a heated argument erupted. "You said Dale would pay," Brenda snapped, her voice tight with frustration, the words of bitter accusation. "You promised me he'd take care of everything." Gary just shrugged, retreating behind a wall of indifference, claiming things didn't work out as planned. The broken promise hung in the air, a sour taste in Brenda's mouth. Gary started looking for quick cash, his desperation palpable. He spent more time down at Gus's garage, a dingy place known for its shady dealings. Whispers started circulating about a few questionable schemes, small-time operations that never seemed to quite pan out. The men he associated with were rougher, their faces unfamiliar to Brenda, their intentions unclear. One afternoon on her way to an extra shift, Brenda saw me. I was walking out of the factory, lunch pail in hand, my shoulders squared. I looked tired, perhaps, but steady. A pang, sharp and unexpected, hit her. She couldn't quite name the feeling, a mix of regret, maybe, or something akin to loss. I didn't see her. The town gossip mill, ever vigilant, began to grind out a new narrative. Brenda and Gary's struggles became common knowledge, openly discussed over coffee and at the grocery store. People compared their chaotic life to my quiet perseverance, my steady job, my continued presence. The contrast was stark, and it didn't favor them. Mr. Schmidt, the landlord, cornered Brenda one morning when she was trying to drop off a partial rent payment. He expressed his concern, his voice low and firm. "Rent's late again, Brenda," he said, his eyes flicking toward the apartment door. "And Gary's friends, they look like trouble. We can't have that here." Brenda's doubts, once small and easily dismissed, began to grow. She remembered my unwavering steadiness, my predictable routines, my quiet reliability. It stood in stark contrast to Gary's impulsiveness, his grandiose but empty promises, his constant search for an easy way out. The foundation of her new life felt shaky. One afternoon, she saw me at the general store picking up some hardware. She tried to approach me, a small tentative step, a soft "Dale" on her lips. But I turned, saw her, and without a word turned away and walked out the door, honoring the no-contact order. The gesture was clear, cold, and final. Gary's recklessness added another layer to their financial woes. He got into a minor fender bender down on Main Street, a crumpled bumper and a shattered headlight. The police report revealed he'd been driving without insurance. The repairs, the fines, the added expenses, it was a cascade of bad choices. "This isn't what I imagined," Brenda confided in Martha, her coworker at the diner, during a slow afternoon. She spoke of Gary, of the bills, of the constant worry, her voice flat, devoid of its usual spark. Martha just nodded, her face kind but unsurprised. The Honeymoon apartment, once a symbol of escape and new beginnings, became a cramped, tension-filled space. The walls felt like they were closing in, stifling the last vestiges of Brenda's dream. It was far from the sun-drenched paradise she had envisioned. It was just a small, dusty apartment in Miller's Ridge. My days settled into a grim routine. The whistle at the factory signaled the start of another 10-hour shift. The rhythmic clang and hiss of the machines a dull background to my thoughts. Then it was home, to the small apartment above my parents' garage, a place of quiet evenings spent alone. The television played muted, a low hum in the background, a barrier against the silence. Sleep came, but it was rarely restful. The legal battle, a slow-moving, grinding machine, drained me. Each letter from Mr. Henderson, each court date, peeled away a layer of my reserves. My parents' help, both financial and emotional, was a steadying force, but I felt the weight of it, the sacrifice etched into their tired faces. The money they spent felt like a direct consequence of my mistakes, a burden I couldn't alleviate. The community remained a landscape of subtle judgments. Some neighbors, like old Mrs. Johnson from across the street, would offer a soft, "How are you doing, Dale?" accompanied by a knowing, sympathetic nod. Others, particularly those whose kids ran with Brenda and Gary's crowd, kept their distance. Their gazes were quick, fleeting, filled with an unspoken curiosity and a clear wariness of the scandal clinging to my name. One Tuesday, I drove through town after picking up some parts for my truck. I saw them in the town square, near the old bandstand. Brenda and Gary were arguing, their voices rising, sharp and clear even from a distance. Brenda's arms were waving, Gary's face was red. I watched for a moment, a detached pity stirring within me, a recognition of the mess they were making. Then I pressed the accelerator, driving past, letting the scene disappear in my rearview mirror. A few days later, my father mentioned a job. "Your Uncle Jim needs an extra hand out on the farm," he said, pushing a plate of fried eggs toward me at breakfast. "Heard you're looking for something outside the factory, something quiet." Uncle Jim lived 20 miles out, past the county line, away from the gossip and the watchful eyes of Miller's Ridge. It was temporary work, but it was an escape. I took the farm job. The work was hard, physical labor that left my muscles aching by sundown. But it was a welcome ache. Driving the tractor across endless fields, smelling the rich earth, mending fences under the vast Midwestern sky, it was a measure of peace. My mind, usually a restless churn of worries, found a quiet rhythm in the repetitive tasks. The open fields felt like a wide open space in my head. My old truck, the one I had rebuilt with my father, the one Brenda had always mocked for being too old and not fancy enough, now served as my faithful escape. It was reliable, sturdy, a constant companion on the long drives to and from the farm. Its engine hummed a familiar tune, a counterpoint to the quiet reflections that filled my journey. Being away from the immediate drama, the daily interactions with the town, allowed me to see Brenda and Gary's actions with clearer, less emotional eyes. Their scheme, their grand plans, now seemed less like a betrayal and more like a desperate reach, a clumsy attempt at a life they couldn't sustain. The anger still simmered, but it was tempered by a growing sense of detachment. Mr. Henderson continued to send updates, brief, factual letters outlining the next steps. He always ended with a reminder to remain calm and cooperative, Dale. It will serve you well. His words were a steady hand guiding me through the confusing legal maze. My mother, Sarah, fretted. She would watch me with worried eyes, her hand often reaching out to touch my arm. "It's not fair, Dale," she'd whisper, her voice thick with injustice. My father, Frank, was quieter, but equally supportive. "Stay strong, son," he'd say, his hand firm on my shoulder. "We'll get through this." Their worry was a tangible thing, a constant presence in the house. The burden of the legal bills, a steadily growing figure pressed down on me. I felt it every time I picked up a wrench at the factory or pitched hay on the farm. It drove me to work harder, to save every dime, to look for any extra hour, any extra shift. I needed to pay them back, to lessen their load. A glimmer of hope began to appear. I started looking into night classes at the junior college again, poring over course catalogs in the quiet evenings. Accounting, business management, new paths, new possibilities, a future that stretched beyond Brenda, beyond Miller's Ridge, a future I could build for myself. Despite my growing resolve, the deep wound of Brenda's betrayal still ached. It was a phantom pain, a dull throb in the quiet hours, a reminder of what had been lost. It was not just the relationship, but the trust, the future I had envisioned. Word reached me through casual conversations at the farm supply store that Gary's financial and personal difficulties were escalating. More arguments with Brenda, more questionable dealings at Gus's garage, hints of trouble brewing on his end. I listened, but didn't engage. I resolved to face the charges. Not for revenge, not to prove a point to Brenda or Gary, but to clear my name, to shed the shadow that hung over me, and finally to start fresh, to build a future piece by quiet piece on my own terms. Gary's desperation had grown roots, wrapping itself around him like a suffocating vine. Deep in debt, with Brenda's unhappiness a constant sour note in their small apartment, he turned to illicit means. The gossip wasn't just about his gambling anymore. It was about pawned electronics, small-time cons at the gas station, always looking for a quick, dirty dollar. His face grew thinner, his eyes sharper, darting nervously. Brenda's regret, I gathered, was a bitter thing. Martha, her coworker at the diner, occasionally dropped small details, quiet observations. Brenda saw her life crumbling, the shiny veneer gone, exposing the rot underneath. She'd chosen flash, Martha implied, over the steady, dependable substance she'd left behind. Now she was paying the price. Martha, a kind woman with tired eyes, tried to mediate once. She cornered me after my shift at the factory, her voice low. "Brenda's got it rough, Dale," she'd said, her gaze steady. "She's not the girl you remember." I just shook my head. The no-contact order was clear, and honestly, I wasn't ready. Brenda wasn't ready either, Martha admitted, her pride still a thick wall. Gary's anger towards me, I knew, hadn't faded. It had festered, fueled by his own growing failures. He saw me not as a man he had wronged, but as the root of his problems, the obstacle in his path. I would sometimes catch his eye across a crowded store aisle, and his face would contort, a silent threat passing between us. The final hammer blow to their living situation came with Mr. Schmidt's ultimatum. He'd shown up at their door, a crisp, official-looking eviction notice in his hand. 2 months late on rent, complaints from other tenants about noise and unsavory visitors. Mr. Schmidt, a man of few words and strict rules, had run out of patience. It was around this time Brenda discovered the Honeymoon Fund. The small savings they had managed to accumulate for the Florida trip, tucked away in an old shoebox in their closet, was gone. Gary had taken it, piece by piece, to cover his gambling debts. Martha described Brenda's shock, her quiet fury, the complete unraveling of her trust. Gary, truly desperate now, started concocting a new scheme. This wasn't petty theft or card games. This involved Silas Croft, a local businessman with a reputation for shady dealings, a man whose name was always whispered, never spoken plainly. The specifics weren't clear, but the implications were darker, more dangerous. Brenda, feeling truly trapped, considered reaching out to me. Martha mentioned it, her voice laced with concern. Brenda paced her apartment, phone in hand, rehearsing words she knew she couldn't say. Her pride, a stubborn companion, held her back. The legal situation, the restraining order, felt like an insurmountable barrier. I, meanwhile, found a quiet strength in my new routine. At Uncle Jim's farm, I excelled. The physical labor suited me, my hands growing calloused and strong. Uncle Jim, a man of few compliments, would offer a gruff nod of approval. I found new connections, quiet nods of respect from other farmhands, a shared understanding in the hard work. My world felt smaller, but more solid. The rumor mill, fueled by Gary's antics, expanded. Whispers about his increasingly erratic behavior and dangerous associates began to circulate further than just the town square. People talked about him owing money to unsavory characters, about his car being seen in places it shouldn't be. One afternoon, picking up new spark plugs at the hardware store, I overheard a conversation near the paint aisle. Two men, their voices low, were discussing Gary. "He's deep in it now," one said. "Owes Silas Croft a fortune. Said he's got a big score coming, though gonna make it all back." I froze, pretending to study a can of rust-proof primer, letting the details sink in. A seed of doubt, cold and unsettling, began to form. I wondered if Gary's escalating troubles, his desperation, might impact my own legal situation. Could it offer a way out, a path to clear my name that didn't involve more courtrooms and more expense? It made me wonder, watching the ripples of their chaos spread, how far a man might go when backed into a corner, and how much those early, seemingly small choices could cost. It made you want to stick around to the end to see how life's costly choices unfold. Brenda's fear, Martha reported, was no longer just about financial ruin. It was genuine, palpable. Gary's temper flared more frequently, his words sharp and unpredictable. His desperation was a tangible thing, a heavy shadow in their small living space. Then came the accident. It wasn't a fender bender this time. Gary's truck, the old beat-up Ford he'd bought cheap, was found crumpled in a ditch on a deserted road outside of town. Late one night, he was unharmed, but the truck was totaled. The local suspicions were immediate. Whispered, no skid marks, a strange angle of impact. It felt staged. Brenda, distraught, tried to warn Gary. She pleaded with him, Martha relayed, to step back, to get out of whatever he was planning. But he dismissed her, his eyes glazed over, consumed by his own misguided plans, convinced this big score was his only way out. He was beyond reason. The final court date for my assault charge landed on the calendar like a heavy stone, shattering the quiet stability I had found on Uncle Jim's farm. It was a Tuesday in early spring, a week when the first green shoots were pushing through the cold earth, a promise of new life. Yet my own future felt mired in the past. The dark cloud it cast stretched long across my renewed purpose. Gary, meanwhile, was spinning a yarn about his accident. He claimed a deer, then later a stray dog, had darted out onto the deserted road, causing him to swerve and total his truck. Deputy Olson listened, his face impassive, his pen poised over his notepad. "Funny," he'd said, his voice flat. "How many animals seem to jump in front of vehicles on that particular stretch of road after dark?" The deputy's skepticism was a quiet, damning thing. Brenda found herself at a moral crossroads. She had information, fragments of Gary's increasingly erratic plans, details of their initial scheme, that could cast a stark new light on my case. It could clear my name, but it would undeniably implicate Gary, the man she had chosen. The weight of that knowledge settled heavily on her. Martha, ever the steady anchor, urged Brenda to tell the truth. "It's time to stop lying, Brenda," she'd said, her voice firm, according to the whispers that reached me. "For your own sake and for Dale's, you can't keep living like this." Martha's words were a direct challenge to the comfortable fictions Brenda had built. Mr. Henderson, my lawyer, called me in for a meeting. He advised me to be prepared for the worst, laying out the prosecution's case in stark, factual terms. But then, almost as an afterthought, he mentioned the rumors, the growing buzz about Gary's questionable activities, his mounting debts. He didn't elaborate, but the implication hung in the air. Gary's recklessness might, ironically, become a factor in my favor. Gary filling the walls closing in made an even more dangerous deal. This time, it wasn't just Silas Croft. It involved more names, bigger risks, a sense of frantic desperation. He saw it as his last chance, his final roll of the dice to escape the hole he had dug. The details were vague, but the undercurrent of peril was clear. Brenda's sleepless nights became a regular feature of her life. The moral dilemma consumed her, keeping her staring at the ceiling in the dark. She weighed her past actions, the choices that had led her here, against the slim chance at redemption, at setting things right. The future, once so clear, now felt murky, fraught with impossible choices. My parents, their faces etched with worry, sat me down one evening. "Dale," my mother began, her voice trembling, "you have to do whatever it takes to clear your name. We can't let them do this to you." My father nodded, his gaze firm. Even if it meant exposing Brenda and Gary, the truth matters. Their plea was a quiet, desperate push towards resolution. In a moment of desperate clarity, a break from her usual pattern, Brenda made a call. She secretly contacted Mr. Henderson, my lawyer. Martha had given her his number. She showed up at his office after hours, looking pale and determined. Brenda sat across from Mr. Henderson's desk, the lamp casting long shadows. Tearfully, haltingly, she confessed. She laid out the full extent of her and Gary's original plan. The apartment, the Florida trip, the expectation that I would pay. She detailed Gary's subsequent threats, his descent into gambling, his dangerous associates, his accident. The story came out in painful fragments, piecing together a mosaic of manipulation and escalating lies. Mr. Henderson now held critical information. It was a double-edged sword. It could undoubtedly help my case, but its use was complicated by Brenda's own involvement in the initial scheme, her own culpability in setting the stage. He listened, his expression unreadable, a single hand resting on his chin. Gary's downward spiral continued unabated. He lost his job at the Yam station after a string of unexplained cash shortages. His few remaining friends, tired of his erratic behavior and constant requests for money, began to distance themselves. He was becoming an island, isolated by his own choices. I grappled with an inner conflict. The idea of using Brenda's confession, of airing her dirty laundry in open court, felt complicated. It would clear my name, undoubtedly. But at what cost to her? Did I want to inflict that kind of public humiliation, even after everything? It was a messy situation, devoid of easy answers. Mr. Henderson, sensing my hesitation, spoke plainly. "The truth, Dale," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "no matter how messy, is your best defense. It's the only thing that can truly set you free." His words cut through the moral ambiguity, offering a clear path forward. Brenda, having made her decision to tell the truth, braced herself. She knew the inevitable fallout from Gary would be severe. He wouldn't take it quietly. But for the first time in a long time, Martha noted, she felt a strange sense of quiet resolve. The day of my trial arrived, heralded by a dull, overcast sky. The small Miller's Ridge courtroom was packed again, a familiar sight, but this time the tension was a physical thing, pressing in from all sides. Every hard wooden bench was filled, every whisper hushed as Judge Evans took her seat. Gary was called first. He looked disheveled, his hair a mess, his face pale and drawn. He took the stand, his testimony a rehash of his original, embellished story of my unprovoked assault. He spoke of fear, of being victimized, his voice cracking with feigned emotion. He stuck to it, stubbornly, eyes darting occasionally toward Brenda in the back row. Mr. Henderson, my lawyer, rose for cross-examination. His voice was calm, almost conversational, but his questions were precise, like surgical instruments. He led Gary through his timeline, subtly highlighting inconsistencies. He hinted at Gary's recent financial troubles, his gambling debts, his desperation. "And you expected Mr. Miller to finance your new life, didn't you, Mr. Peterson?" he asked, his gaze unwavering. Gary stammered, denying everything, his composure beginning to fray. Then came the surprise. The defense calls Brenda Jenkins to the stand. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. A hush fell, heavy and complete. Gary, sitting at the prosecution table, flinched, his head snapping toward Brenda, a look of pure shock on his face. Brenda, dressed simply, walked slowly to the stand, her steps measured, her gaze fixed straight ahead. With a shaky voice, barely a whisper at first, Brenda began to recount the truth. She spoke of her original intentions with me, of the plan she and Gary had concocted to use my money for their apartment in the Florida trip. She detailed Gary's escalating deceit, his gambling, his accident, the mounting debts. Each word was a brick, slowly dismantling the wall of lies Gary had built. She described the shame, the regret, the fear she now felt. Gary erupted. "She's lying," he yelled, lunging forward from his seat, his face contorted with rage. "You're a liar, Brenda. Don't you listen to her." Deputy Olson and another bailiff moved quickly, restraining him, but his outburst, far from discrediting Brenda, only solidified her credibility. His wild rage was a stark contrast to her quiet, painful confession. I watched Brenda from my seat, a complex mix of old hurt and a new, dawning understanding washing over me. The betrayal still ached, a deep, persistent wound, but there was also something else, a recognition of her own pain, her own misguided journey. I remained calm, my gaze steady, letting her words, raw and unvarnished, fill the space. Judge Evans listened intently, her expression unreadable, her eyes moving between Brenda, Gary, and me. She allowed Brenda to continue, interrupting only to ensure clarity. The true narrative, messy and tangled, was finally unfolding, piece by painful piece. Deputy Olson was called next. He testified about Gary's recent accident, detailing the lack of skid marks, the strange circumstances. He also presented evidence of Gary's mounting financial troubles, his debts to Silas Croft, hinting at a wider pattern of illegal activity that the sheriff's department was actively investigating. The threads were beginning to connect. Brenda, still on the stand, offered a personal confession. Her voice trembled, but her words were clear. I regret how I manipulated Dale," she said, her eyes meeting mine for a fleeting moment. "How I led him on. I was selfish. I was wrong." It wasn't an apology directly to me, not in a personal sense, but a public acknowledgement of her own culpability, a stark admission of guilt. The case went to the jury. They were left to sift through the interwoven truths and lies, the layers of deceit, manipulation, and desperation that had come to light. The courtroom buzzed with low murmurs as they filed out, their faces solemn. The townspeople were stunned. Many murmured, their voices low but audible, about how they had misjudged me, how they had been quick to condemn, to believe the easy story. Others shook their heads, their pity now directed towards Brenda, caught in Gary's downward spiral. The narrative of Miller's Ridge had shifted. Gary, witnessing his world crumble around him, saw the writing on the wall. As the jury disappeared behind the deliberation room door, he made a desperate run from the courthouse. He bolted from his seat, pushing past the bailiffs, creating a brief, chaotic commotion before he was tackled by Deputy Olson on the courthouse lawn. I, though the focus of the trial, maintained a quiet, dignified presence. The truth finally spoken was doing its work. I let it speak for itself, a quiet strength settling over me. Brenda, still on the stand, caught my eye. There was no apology in her gaze, no expectation of forgiveness. But there was a silent acknowledgement, a raw, shared understanding of what had transpired, of the mistakes made, and the long, difficult road ahead for both of us. The jury returned, their faces grim, a hushed silence falling over the courtroom. The foreman stood, cleared his throat, and in a clear, measured voice pronounced the verdict, "Not guilty." A collective, shaky sigh of relief escaped my parents and sister, a wave of tension visibly draining from their shoulders. The gavel fell, sharp and final. Just a few blocks from the courthouse, Gary's desperate flight ended. Deputy Olson, who had pursued him in his cruiser, apprehended him in the alley behind the old movie theater. He was cuffed, read his rights, and loaded into the back of the patrol car. Now Gary faced not only the original charges, but also additional counts for flight and the illicit activities that Deputy Olson had quietly been investigating. His world, which he had tried to keep suspended by lies, finally crashed down. Brenda, still in Miller's Ridge, began to face her own reckoning. The diner where she had worked for years let her go. Public perception, coupled with the undeniable dishonesty revealed in court, made her a liability. The whispers that once followed me now clung to her, a suffocating cloak of judgment. Her choices had a price, and she was beginning to pay it in full. My name was cleared. It was a tangible weight lifted, a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. The community, understanding the full story, the intricate web of deceit and desperation, slowly began to offer apologies. Old Mr. Henderson from the hardware store stopped me to shake my hand. Mrs. Johnson offered a knowing, gentle smile. A renewed respect, quiet but steady, replaced the suspicion. A week after the trial, I was having coffee at the diner, an old habit. Brenda walked in, her movements tentative. She approached my booth, her eyes downcast. "Dale?" she asked, her voice soft. She sat opposite me, uninvited, but I didn't object. "I was wrong, Dale," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "About everything. I'm truly sorry." There was no expectation in her eyes, no plea for forgiveness, just a raw, honest apology. I listened, my hands wrapped around my coffee mug. The diner was nearly empty, the air thick with the smell of brewing coffee and unspoken history. "It took a lot to say that, Brenda," I responded, my voice measured. "Thank you." The past, however, could not be undone. The scars, though healing, remained. I let her words hang in the air, acknowledged but not absolved. Gary's sentencing came quickly. He pleaded guilty to most of the charges, unable to dispute the overwhelming evidence. Fraud, possession of stolen goods, resisting arrest. He received a significant jail term, years that would strip away the bravado and leave him to confront the consequences of his choices. He was gone from Miller's Ridge, a chapter closed. Brenda found herself isolated. Her former friends, the ones who had cheered her on, now kept their distance. They couldn't reconcile the Brenda they thought they knew with the woman who had stood on the witness stand, detailing her own manipulations. The phone rarely rang. Her social circle, built on superficiality, had dissolved. I made a decision. I accepted Uncle Jim's offer to partner on the farm. The factory work, while steady, no longer held the same appeal. The land called to me, the open fields a symbol of freedom. It was a new path, a future built on hard work and honest labor, far from the false promises of the factory floor. Brenda left town shortly after. Martha mentioned she'd moved to a bigger city, somewhere she wouldn't be recognized. She couldn't bear the weight of her reputation, the constant reminder of her mistakes. She sought a fresh start, a clean slate, somewhere else. A quiet goodbye, a whispered departure. My parents were immensely proud. They saw their son emerge from the ordeal stronger, wiser, tempered by fire. My mother cried tears of relief. My father clapped me on the back, his eyes shining. The weight they had carried for me had finally lifted. I found purpose and satisfaction in the land. The rhythm of the seasons, the feel of rich earth in my hands, the steady growth of crops. It was real, tangible. I slowly built a new life, grounded and true, far from the petty dramas that once consumed me. The emotional scars from the betrayal and the trial remained, etched deep within me. They were constant reminders, quiet lessons learned, warnings against blind trust and easy promises. They were part of who I was now. Despite the pain, there was a profound sense of closure. The truth, messy and complicated as it was, had set me free. Not just from legal charges, but from the emotional shackles of anger and confusion. Life's simple pleasures took on new meaning. A sunset over the cornfields, the quiet conversation with Uncle Jim, the satisfaction of a hard day's work. My world had shrunk, in a way, but it felt more honest, more real. The dramatic affair that once consumed me was now just a distant echo, a story from another life. A few years had passed. The fields around Miller's Ridge had seen multiple cycles of planting and harvest. I was no longer just Dale Miller, the young man tangled in a small-town scandal. I was Dale Miller, the farmer, respected for my hard work, my integrity, and the quiet way I went about my business. My partnership with Uncle Jim had flourished. The farm, once a refuge, had become a thriving enterprise. New machinery, red and gleaming, sat in the barns, a testament to our steady growth. We had expanded, bought more acreage, diversified our crops. The land had been good to us, and we had been good to the land. I was a different man. The ordeal had chiseled away some of the youthful naivete, leaving behind a more self-assured, thoughtful individual. I was cautious in my dealings, slow to trust, but also more open to genuine connection. The quiet strength I had found on the farm had seeped into my character. It was at the county fair during a quiet moment between prize livestock showings that I met Sarah. She was from a neighboring town, a veterinarian technician with kind eyes and a laugh that seemed to carry the scent of wildflowers. She listened more than she spoke, appreciated the simple rhythms of life, and she saw my quiet strength, my honest nature, for what it was. We started slow, a friendship built on shared values and mutual respect. Gary Peterson was released from prison, a shadow of the man he once was. The swagger was gone, replaced by a defeated slump in his shoulders. Humbled by his time inside, he struggled to re-enter society. Jobs were scarce, and his reputation, even in a different town, preceded him. I saw him one afternoon at the local general store, picking up a few items. He was thinner, his face etched with regret. Our eyes met across the aisle, a moment of awkward silence. We exchanged a brief, uncomfortable nod, a flicker of distant acknowledgement. No words were needed. The past hung between us, understood, but no longer a weapon. He quickly turned away, disappearing down another aisle. Word reached town through distant cousins and chance encounters that Brenda was living a quiet life in a different state. She worked in a small office, away from the gossip and judgment of Miller's Ridge. She had matured, shed some of her youthful impulsiveness, learned her own hard lessons. She was just Brenda now, trying to make her way. The memory of the affair and the trial still existed in town lore. It was a story passed down, a cautionary tale about choices and consequences, about the hidden depths of character. But it was no longer a fresh wound, no longer the subject of active gossip. It was history, a faded chapter in the town's collective memory. My parents watched me with immense satisfaction. My mother would often just smile, a quiet joy in her eyes. My father, Frank, would nod, his hand resting on my shoulder as we overlooked the fields. They knew their son had built a life on solid ground, a life of integrity and hard work. I often reflected on the painful lessons learned, the true cost of deceit, the value of honesty. The wisdom I gained was hard-won, paid for with heartache and struggle, but it was mine, a foundation for all that came after. I had found a way to forgive, not necessarily Brenda or Gary themselves, but the paths, the circumstances, the lingering bitterness. It wasn't about excusing their actions, but about releasing myself from the burden of holding on to the anger. It allowed me to move forward, unencumbered. Sarah and I were planning a modest wedding. Nothing grand, just a quiet ceremony at the local church, a celebration rooted in shared values and mutual respect. We would build our future together, brick by honest brick, on this land, under this sky. The drama of my youth, the betrayal, the courtrooms, the scandal, it all faded into the background. It was replaced by the steady hum of a fulfilling life, the rustle of corn in the wind, the lowing of cattle, Sarah's gentle laughter, the promise of a new day. I often stood on my land, looking out at the vast Midwestern sky, the horizon stretching endless before me. A profound sense of peace settled over me, a quiet contentment. My journey from heartbreak to healing, from anger to understanding, symbolized the resilience and quiet dignity often found in the heartland. Here, hard work and honesty, in the end, truly paved the way home.